we still use their name as a word for destruction. Vandalism. The senseless breaking of things. The mindless ruining of what other people built. The Vandals, in the popular imagination, are the ultimate barbarians. The people who swept in from the darkness, smashed what they found, and left nothing behind but rubble. Here's what actually happened. In 429 AD, a king named Genseric led 80,000 people. Men, women, children, elderly, cattle, everything they owned, across the Strait of Gibraltar into Roman North Africa. It was one of the most extraordinary migrations in the ancient world. The Vandals were not a naval people. They had no tradition of seamanship, and yet Genseric organized the crossing, found or built enough vessels to move his entire nation across open water, and landed in Africa with an intact fighting force and a viable civilian population. 26 years later, he was the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean. His fleet dominated the sea. His kingdom controlled the grain supply that fed the city of Rome. And when he finally sacked Rome itself in 455 AD, he did it with more discipline and less destruction than almost anyone who had ever sacked the city before him. The Vandals did not destroy civilization. They moved it. To understand how this happened, you need to understand where the Vandals came from and what Rome actually looked like in the 5th century. Because it was not the Rome of the legions and the aqueducts and the marble forums. It was a Roman Empire in the process of slow, grinding collapse. The Vandals originated somewhere in Scandinavia, drifted south over centuries, and by the late 4th century were living in the Danube frontier region of the Roman Empire. Like many Germanic peoples of the period, they were simultaneously insiders and outsiders, trading with Rome, serving in Roman armies, absorbing Roman culture, and being pushed by the pressure of the Hunnic migrations from the east. When the Huns moved west, they set off a cascade of population movements that sent Germanic peoples across Rome's borders in waves. The Vandals crossed the Rhine in 406 AD with a coalition of other peoples. They spent the next decade moving through Gaul, leaving a trail of disruption before crossing into Spain around 409 AD. In Spain, they settled, until the Visigoths arrived and began pushing them south toward the coast. And there, Genseric made his move. He was elected king of the Vandals in 428 AD, at a moment when his people were being squeezed off the Iberian Peninsula. He received an invitation, possibly from a Roman military commander named Boniface, who was engaged in his own power struggle within the empire, to cross to Africa. Whether the invitation was real, whether it was a pretext, whether Genseric needed any pretext at all is debated. What is certain is that in 429 AD he organized the crossing. 80,000 people is not an army. It is a nation. Moving a nation across the Mediterranean requires logistics that most ancient armies never attempted. Provisioning for civilians, moving animals, coordinating a fleet large enough to transport not hundreds of soldiers but tens of thousands of families. Genseric did it. How he assembled the ships is not clearly recorded. The crossing happened. The Vandals landed in North Africa with their nation intact. Roman North Africa. The provinces of Mauritania, Numidia, and Africa Proconsularis was one of the wealthiest regions in the empire. The great city of Carthage, rebuilt by Rome after its legendary destruction by Scipio Africanus, was the second city of the Western Empire. The grain that fed Rome came from African fields. The olive oil that filled Roman lamps came from African presses. The empire's largest theological debates, the ones that defined Christianity for the next 15 centuries, had been happening in the cities of North Africa for generations. Augustine of Hippo, who would die in 430 AD as the Vandals besieged his city, had spent his life there. Genseric understood what he had. He did not destroy what he found. He occupied it. He spent the next decade consolidating control of North Africa, piece by piece. His forces avoided, where possible, the destruction of productive infrastructure. The farms continued to produce. The trade routes remained open. The port cities stayed functional. He besieged Carthage in 439 AD and captured it, making it his capital, not a burned ruin, a capital. Then he built a navy. This is perhaps the most remarkable achievement. The Vandals had no seafaring tradition. And yet within a decade of arriving in North Africa, Genseric had constructed a fleet capable of operating across the entire Western Mediterranean. He raided Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. He threatened the Italian coast. The Roman Empire, which had not needed to think seriously about naval defense in the Western Mediterranean for centuries, suddenly faced a naval power operating out of Carthage. The leverage this gave Genseric was extraordinary. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the grain. Whoever controlled the grain controlled Rome, the emperors in Ravenna. The Western Roman Empire had moved its capital there for its defensive position, could not simply ignore Genseric. They negotiated with him. They signed treaties with him. One emperor gave his daughter in betrothal to Genseric's son. Genseric played the factions of the collapsing Western Empire against each other with extraordinary diplomatic skill. And then, in 455 AD, the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III was assassinated. His successor, Petronius Maximus, broke the betrothal agreement between the imperial princess and Genseric's son. Genseric sailed to Italy. The sack of Rome in 455 lasted 2 weeks. Genseric gave his men explicit orders: no killing, no burning, no destruction. The sources record that these orders were largely followed. The Vandals seized the imperial treasury. They took the treasures that the Emperor Titus had brought to Rome from the temple in Jerusalem. The menorah, the golden table, objects that had been sitting in Rome for nearly 4 centuries. They took gold, silver, jewels, silk. They took skilled craftsmen. They took the empress and her daughters. They did not kill the senators. They did not burn the temples or the forums. They did not torch the palaces. They loaded their ships and sailed back to Carthage. The sack of 455 is remembered as a great catastrophe of Roman history. Compare it to the Visigoth sack of 410, which involved widespread killing, burning, and 3 days of uncontrolled looting by an army that had no discipline imposed on it. The Vandal sack was, by the standards of ancient warfare, almost restrained. The word vandalism attached to their name for a destruction that was, historically speaking, one of the milder ones Rome ever experienced. Genseric lived until 477 AD. He outlived 4 Western Roman emperors. He outlasted the Western Roman Empire itself, which collapsed in 476 AD when the last emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed. Genseric had been more successful at holding a state together than the Romans had been. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa lasted until 534 AD, 105 years. In that time, it developed a sophisticated court culture, produced theologians and poets writing in Latin, maintained trade networks across the Mediterranean, and administered one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. The Vandals had absorbed Roman administrative practices, Roman law, and the Latin language. They were Arian Christians in a world of increasingly aggressive Catholic orthodoxy, which made them a target for religious hostility. Much of the negative historical writing about them comes from Catholic sources with obvious reasons to be unflattering. In 533 to 534 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian sent his general Belisarius to reconquer North Africa. Belisarius was one of the finest military commanders of the era, and the Vandal kingdom by that point had been weakened by internal disputes. The kingdom fell. The last Vandal king, Gelimer, was captured and taken in chains to Constantinople, where he was displayed in Justinian's triumph. The treasures from Jerusalem, the menorah, the golden table, the objects that had sat in Rome for 4 centuries and in Carthage for 80 years, traveled to Constantinople. Some accounts suggest they were eventually returned to Jerusalem. Some suggest they disappeared into the imperial treasury. The trail runs cold. Here is what stays with you. The word vandalism is in every language that descended from Latin. It means destruction, ruin, the mindless breaking of civilization. It is the legacy of a people who, in actual historical fact, crossed a sea with their entire nation, built a Mediterranean empire from nothing, sacked Rome with more restraint than Rome usually showed its own enemies, and maintained a functioning, sophisticated state for over a century. Genseric is one of the least famous and most capable rulers in the ancient world. He started with a people being pushed off a peninsula with nowhere to go. He ended with a kingdom that outlasted the empire he had raided. The barbarians did not destroy Rome's civilization. They took the most productive part of it, moved it to Africa, and ran it better than Rome had been running it by the end.